All right, thank you very much. This is the second afternoon panel. We'll be hearing about fairness, and this is going to be moderated by our very own Hanna Wallach from our sister lab, MSR New York. So we'll take it off.
Great. Okay. So now that Nicole has told you all to sit down, I want you all to stand back up. Great. Okay. Now I want you to either stamp your feet, jump up and down, or stretch. Okay. Perfect. Now you can sit back down. All right. So I want this to be an interactive panel, and I want people to ask questions, and so I wanted to make sure you were all paying attention. Good. All right. So as Nicole said, I'm Hanna. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a principal researcher in Microsoft Research New York and an adjunct professor at UMass Amherst. And my background is in machine learning. And specifically, I study machine learning and society. So I both use machine learning to study society, and I study the effects that machine learning has on society as machine learning and AI are becoming much more common and widespread. And over the past few years, I've been concentrating specifically on issues of fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics as they relate to AI and machine learning. Indeed, that is the topic of today's panel, unsurprisingly. And I think it's a really important and timely topic. So I'm really glad that we're having this panel discussion on this here today. So at this point, it's pretty clear that we're kind of living in the age of AI. Machine learning is everywhere, and at least for the moment, it looks like it's here to stay. And this is great. This is great for researchers like me. This is great for companies like Microsoft. But at the same time, we're also seeing that these kinds of opportunities also raise new challenges, and challenges that have received a lot of attention in the media recently, and have really highlighted how important it is that we get AI right, that we don't let AI discriminate or disadvantage previously disadvantaged groups. So how many of you have seen one of these stories? Great, so pretty much everyone. That's what I was hoping for. Good. So then you'll know that this is a really complicated and fraught landscape with a lot of different key stakeholders, ranging from, yeah, sure, researchers, but companies like Microsoft, the government, civil rights and civil liberties organizations, and of course the people who use these technologies and who are affected by these technologies in their lives. So we have a really accomplished group of panelists here today: Timnit Gebru, Debbie Hellman, Adam Kalai, and Mira Lane. And they're going to explore this landscape here today. And in turn, I hope that you'll walk away from this panel with a deeper understanding of why these issues are so important, why they're non-trivial, why they really get at the core of the relationship between technology and society, and why it's important that we take them really seriously, even when there are no obvious right answers. So here's how this is going to go. I am going to start by briefly introducing the panelists. And then I'm going to ask each panelist to talk for a few minutes about themselves, their own work, and how their work relates to the topics of fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask them a series of questions to get the discussion going. And after that, I'm going to hand the floor over to you. And this is really your opportunity. I'm sure many of you have questions about these topics that you really want to know the answers to. This is your opportunity to ask them. Okay, and if at any time you want to ask a question, either while the panelists are talking about their own work or while I'm asking questions, you should feel free to do so. Just raise your hand and I will wave at Nicole and she will run a mic over to you. Okay, wonderful, great. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists. Okay, so Timnit Gebru just finished her postdoc in the FATE group at Microsoft Research New York, and we miss her a lot. She is now a research scientist in the ethical AI team at Google AI, and she's currently studying the ethical considerations underlying any data mining project and methods of auditing and mitigating bias in socio-technical systems. As a co-founder of the group Black in AI, she works to both increase diversity in the field and to reduce the negative impacts of racial bias in training data used for human-centric machine learning models. Great. So, Debbie Hellman is the D. Lurton Massey Professor of Law in the University of Virginia School of Law. And her work focuses on discrimination, both from a philosophical and a legal perspective. She's particularly interested in the questions, what is discrimination and what makes it wrong? In fact, she wrote a book called When is Discrimination Wrong? In 2008 and has continued to work on these topics in the years since. She's also new to AI and therefore wants you to know that you shouldn't ask her anything super technical. Okay. Adam. Adam Kalai is a very serious principal researcher in Microsoft Research New England, although he is better known as the husband of Yael Kalai. Adam has had over 50 papers rejected, counting multiple submissions, multiple times, in top computer science venues. Only the best for Adam. The last time I moderated a panel that Adam was on, he made a fool of me. I am going to get my revenge, but I have decided that I won't tell him when this is going to happen. It might be in today's panel. It might be in the next panel that I moderate that he's on. We will see. And our final panelist is Mira Lane, who is the Partner Director of Ethics and Society within Cloud and AI at Microsoft. She has a background in art, computer science, and mathematics. And she holds numerous patents across platforms and collaborative interfaces. Mira's team is responsible for guiding technical and experience innovation towards ethical, responsible, and sustainable outcomes. So, please join me in welcoming our panelists. Okay, so now we're going to have the panelists each talk a little bit about their work and how it relates to fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics. And I think maybe what we'll do, since I started with Tim Neat before, I will start with Mira this time.
Okay. So as Hannah was saying, I'm part of the engineering team at Microsoft. I'm not part of Microsoft Research. But what you've heard over and over again in all of the panels is a need for a bridge between research and what's happening on the applied side. And so my team acts as a bridge. And what we do is we take ideas and policies that are happening in research and across Microsoft, and then we look at those and say, how do we bring these into an engineering context? And how do we apply these so that thousands of engineers, designers, product thinkers, sales folks can then do responsible things with technology? This involves everything from looking at how we collect data, how we do scenario planning, how we look at impact and consequences of our work, how we actually develop and where we set benchmarks in our code, and then how we maintain our systems at the once they've gone out the door. And so this is a new type of model in the company. I don't think anything like this quite exists. And so it's an experiment. We're innovating and we're trying new things. But it's a fairly big investment. There's about 20 people working on this. It's a multidisciplinary group. There's social psychologists on the team. There are developers, designers, storytellers, creative coders. And so we're playing around in this space, and we're trying to bring responsible thinking and responsible innovation into a complex and gnarly space where we look at speech technologies, facial recognition. We do things around virtual reality and HoloLens. And so a lot of the gnarly things that you tend to see in the news are in this group that I'm working on.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, Adam.
I'm a machine learning AI researcher, and you could think of me as the naive user of AI and machine learning that would have naturally, made algorithms that discriminate, except that I'm in this lab surrounded by people like this and many other people in our lab, and they made us think before, oh, gee, maybe we should think a little bit about what these technologies will do, and then we started doing that and uncovering various biases that we saw in words that you might see, gender bias or racial biases, and what effects those would have on various algorithms we designed. So we are also thinking about how we might deal with that.
Great, thank you, Adam. Okay.
Okay, I hope I'm not going to talk for too long because those were shorter, but I thought I'd tell you about a paper I'm working on now just because I always think it's interesting to hear what people are working on and because it's a great resource. It's a little bit selfish, great resource for me. In case you guys have some input, I would love to hear it because, as I said, I'm a bit of an interloper here. So I'm working on a paper that has to do with the controversy about the COMPAS risk assessment tool, which I imagine most of you are familiar with. I see most heads nodding, but just briefly, it's a risk assessment tool that's used to determine who should get out of prison early on parole. It's also used in bail settings in many, many states around the country. And there was a big brouhaha after an expose by ProPublica, which alleged that the tool discriminated between blacks and whites and didn't treat them fairly. And the response from the company that makes COMPAS, which is North Point, was to say, that's not true. The tool does treat blacks and whites fairly, or doesn't discriminate between blacks and whites. And the upshot of that debate was that they were focusing on different measures, that North Point was focusing on one measure for assessing whether blacks and whites are treated equally, and ProPublica and the critics of COMPAS were focusing on another measure. That led to then a series of papers by people like you all that showed that in many, many contexts, in fact, in most contexts, it would be impossible to equalize with regard to both measures. That is, you couldn't treat blacks and whites equally with regard to the measure that North Point was focusing on, and at the same time with regard to the measure that ProPublica was focusing on, thus leading to the question, which one should we prefer and why? And in a second series of papers that looked at that question, that second generation question was posed as, which measure of fairness should we prefer and why? And where I want to intercede in this debate is to say that there's something wrong with that framing, that they're not both measures of fairness, and so we're not comparing two things in the same domain, that one of the measures is a measure of fairness, and the other measure maybe has some implications for fairness, but isn't itself a measure of fairness. So just to, if I can say a few more words, the two measures, the one that North Point was focusing on was if two people get a risk score of, let's say, 8 out of 10, that a black person and a white person who both get a score of 8 are equally likely to recidivate. That is, 8 out of 10 people who get that score will, in fact, recidivate. So the score was equally predictive for both groups. So it was an equal predictive accuracy. And that was true for the COMPAS tool. The measure that ProPublica was focused on was not asking if you got a score, what was the likelihood that you would recidivate, but was asking the question in a different kind of way, was saying, if you were someone who was at low risk for recidivating, what's the likelihood that the tool would accurately characterize you as low risk? And there was a big difference between how a low-risk black and a low-risk white person were characterized by the tool. A low-risk black person was much more likely to be mischaracterized by the tool than a low-risk white person. So another way of characterizing this would be to say the scores were equally accurate. They had equal predictive accuracy, but of course they weren't perfect. And when there were mistakes, the mistakes went in different directions. One had more false positives than the other, more false negatives. So then the question is, which measure do we care about? Equal predictive accuracy or equalizing the error rates, the false positives and false negative rates? And what I'm arguing in this paper, which I'm happy to talk to you more about in the Q&A or in coffee, is that the measure that looked at equalizing the error rates is a measure of fairness because it's looking at what's the burden of mistakes. How are the burdens of mistakes falling equally on the two groups? So it relates to the way in which we treat people. Whereas equal predictive accuracy is about what we believe about people. That is, it's about belief versus action. That is, if the scores don't have equal predictive accuracy, a score of 8 will mean something different for a black person versus a white person if we give up on predictive accuracy. And therefore, I won't know what to believe about a person who has a score of 8. I won't know what to believe about what that means about the likelihood that he or she will recidivate. But a score that relates to what I ought to believe versus what I ought to do is not related to fairness in any straightforward way. And that's the basic conceptual point of the paper, is that predictive accuracy relates to belief, error rate balance relates to action, and therefore is more naturally a fairness-based concern.
I'm glad you brought up the COMPAS data set, because I studied computer vision, and the only interest I had was in studying computer vision. But towards the end of my PhD, I read that ProPublica article, and I was terrified. And so that's kind of how I started to get more interested in these questions of issues and fairness. So my PhD was in using computer vision to do visual data mining. So for example, using images to predict things about society, and that naturally has certain biases, the kinds of biases that we might discuss. And so that's when I realized even my own work kind of suffers from these issues of fairness. And so I then met Joy Bolognini, who is the advisee of Ethan, who was moderating the prior panel. And we worked on a paper showing that there are disparities in commercial face recognition systems in how accurate they are for different subgroups of people. So we looked at skin types. We used the dermatology classification system for skin tone and gender. And in addition to my work in computer vision and this work, I view what's for me equally important is to make sure that the voices of the people who are unfairly affected by these systems are amplified. So for example, because diversity gives you domain knowledge, right? So Joy Bolognini, she's a much darker skinned Black woman. And so the reason that she came up with this idea of using Fitzpatrick's skin type rather than race, which a lot of people had done this kind of analysis with race, is because of her domain knowledge about colorism, about a whole bunch of other things. So I think equally important is to make sure that the people who bring this domain knowledge, that their voices are amplified.
Great, thanks everyone. Okay, so I'm going to start with some questions. And the first question, which I want to ask really is sort of a overview question and kind of stage setting question, is what are the different ways that one might think about whether a decision or output obtained via an AI-based system treats people fairly or not? And I'm going to kick that question over to you, Debbie, because of your background in discrimination.
So the first point I would emphasize about that is that there are different ways of answering that question, and people disagree about that. And so that's what's interesting anyway about it. So obviously one way that people think about what fairness is the idea of treating like cases alike. And I think many people strive for that idea. I don't think that's the only way of thinking about it, and I think we make a mistake if we emphasize that too much, but that is obviously one way of thinking about what fairness is treating like cases alike. Another way would be treating everybody literally the same. That's not that plausible in most situations, but another idea. A third way is one that you mentioned before, which is making sure not to disadvantage already disadvantaged groups. A fourth way, which is we see dominant in legal discourse, is just avoiding the use of certain traits or classifications. That's another conception. And then a fifth one might be not doing things that are demeaning in some way. And that is not an exhaustive list, but just gives you a flavor of possibilities.
Do any of the rest of you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think one of the things to sort of add to that is if we look back into, again, the engineering system, having a robust set of test cases that we can then go and apply against the systems to say what kinds of discrimination might be happening in the system is very important. Because one of the things we don't do right now is actually separate out those subgroups and the categories of people that might be using a system. And it's something that we're trying to build into the new way that we design advanced technologies and look at, well, we know that this system is going to impact these classes of people, and we know that some of these are vulnerable audiences, and how do we proactively go and investigate the system to see how they're performing against certain subgroups, and then go in and set benchmarks and say, okay, your code cannot go out the door if it doesn't meet a certain criteria across all of these different subgroups. And there's a lot of work that we need to do to even get there, but that's how I would take what you're saying and translate it into getting the system to perform a certain way. Because the thing that I worry about the most is that we end up talking about it a lot, but then we don't go and change the system in such a way that it performs in a way that is fair, or it puts fairness into the system. And I don't think enough work is happening in that space right now, which is why this is so important to me to go in and be that bridge between all the great work that you guys are doing and then the engineers who are not necessarily thinking about this problem space in the same way that this group is.
Can I just
make a plug for data sheets for data sets? A paper
Oh,
that we
yes,
wrote,
yes.
and another one that I just wrote called Model Cards for Model Performance, which is trying to basically say, if you're going to, let's take a face recognition system, and before you have a pre-trained model or an API available, like how about you tell us some of the tests that you've done, some of the false positive rates, false negative rates, or we have a whole host of tests, but I'm just making a plug.
So can I say one tweak?
Yeah,
No, you were going to respond.
Well, I was going to say for data sheets, we've actually been spending a lot of time. So I'll give you the high level view, and then maybe Hannah, you can come in and say, Mira, this is maybe there's a more robust way to talk about it. But when I talk about data sheets to our engineers, I say these are basically nutrition labels for data sets. So when you look at a data set, you want to understand the composition of it, what's inside it, how it was collected, how can you use the data, so that if you're going and using this data in another model that you might be training, you have a sense for what that data can be used for and how that data is performing against other things. Yeah? Timnit, you should.
Yeah, that's basically, so there's two parts. So data sheets is for data sets, and I think it would be helpful for even when people are sharing data sets internally, because a lot of times somebody collects a data set, uses it for one purpose, and another team kind of gets that data to try to use it for another purpose, and then some information is lost when you transfer it, right? You don't know what the original reason was that the data set was collected for. You don't know what the legal considerations are. You don't know what the intended use cases are, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the first step, so we talk about fairness, accountability, transparency. I think this is a low-hanging fruit in transparency. I think there's a lot we can do in transparency that we're not doing. And so the follow-up paper that I just mentioned is a similar thing for models, right? Because when we were initially writing data sheets, we were thinking about data sets and models, but it turned out that it's actually very complicated to even just do this idea for data sets. But then there's a second part to it, which is when you're releasing a model or an API, like I've just talked about a paper we wrote with Joy where we were auditing commercial gender classification systems, right? What kind of information are you giving the user? Are you giving them intended use cases? Are you giving them disclaimers like don't use this to decide whether someone is a criminal or not? So that's the follow-up in terms of models.
So I just wanted to push back on one thing that you said, if that's okay, Mira.
Of course.
That, the idea that you're going to kind of audit the I don't know what word you use, but something like that, the systems. You still need to say what you're auditing them for, right? And so if you're auditing them for the idea of treating like cases alike versus auditing them for the idea of disadvantaging previously disadvantaged groups, those are often going to yield very different answers.
Yep.
So it's nice to audit them for fairness, but to the extent that we have different views about what that is, that's going to yield very different projects.
There's one more kind of fairness that you didn't mention, which is very widely, a very common one, which is just that if your system was trained with any kind of data, then it's objective and it's fair.
With any kind of data?
Which is a widely held belief. I don't believe it, but I think in some ways, the data sheets work speaks to that, and it says to people, well, think about what data you used. It's not, but it is a belief that a lot of people have, and that's one that we kind of need to dispel. But it is, many people find that intuitive, or that's their first reaction. Oh, this came with data, therefore it's probably fair. They can justifying things with data is a standard way to justify making decisions, which isn't always fair, obviously.
Yeah. So I'm interested in digging a little bit further into this idea of sort of how each of you thinks about fairness or even measures fairness when it comes to AI-based systems. And as you said, Debbie, there's a whole bunch of different kind of metrics or measures that you can look at. There are various different trade-offs between them, and some types of unfairness might be just inherently very difficult to even quantify or to automate. So I'm interested from all of you to learn a little bit more about which approaches, which measures, which metrics do you use? How do you think about testing for fairness?
Actually, this was a question I wanted to ask Debbie too. I'm wondering, so the way I think about it is I don't have anything to add to the additional, to the metrics that you mentioned, but I wonder, I think it's context specific too, right? Like which metric to use for what purpose. And so when we were talking about auditing systems, the way I think about it is how to just audit it for a whole bunch of different metrics that people have come up with, and then maybe when you know the context, sometimes maybe having false positives is worse than something else, right? And so maybe then the person who's using the system can make a decision about if this system is appropriate or not. What do you think about, what is your opinion on this type of approach? Do you think we should have just one or two metrics that we all agree on and move from there, or?
I agree with you that different contexts call for different things, right? That if I'm trying to decide whether to put someone in jail, the standard for being certain that that person or keeping someone in jail really is guilty is very different than if I'm trying to decide whether to give someone a job. An issue that we saw addressed in the Kavanaugh hearing quite recently, right? The standard for putting someone on the Supreme Court versus putting someone behind bars should be, I think, different, right? So the cost of the false positives versus false negative about that surely are different. So right? So I agree with the idea that context has, makes different things salient. The cost of false positives versus false negatives in different contexts make a huge difference. For sure, I agree with that. But the idea that, we'll throw all our fairness measures out there, and if it passes all of them, it's great, and if it fails all of them, it's probably bad, and if it's passes some and fails some, it's somewhere in between. That's kind of appealing. We were talking about this last night, but I have a worry that all the interesting cases, the ones that really puzzle us, are going to be in those in-between cases. So maybe it's not going to be that helpful, and that really I think the issues are posed because given injustice in society over time, race, sex, and other protected characteristics are going to track with a lot of qualities or traits that people legitimately care about. And so there's a deep moral issue about how disruptive you want to be of those correlations. And that's a moral question or a normative question that we have to address.
Nicole, do you have a question?
Hi, yes, thanks. Very interesting commentary. I was curious, a lot of the discussion of fairness so far has been about the fairness of the outcome, and I'm wondering if there's two different processes that lead to that same outcome. Is there a distinguishing, one is fair and one is not, and we should prefer one process to another, or is it just about the outcome?
I think it depends. I have trouble keeping it in the abstract for some of these because the context and the scenario is so important and so tied to how you would even measure it. And so I guess the answer is it depends on what the scenario is. I don't know, maybe we could run through some cases if there was something.
I think that those are different, that process often matters to fairness. And in fact, it shows us why sometimes we don't care about, say, treating like cases alike in a certain sense. That is the quintessential example of a fair procedure is let's flip a coin, let's draw straws, is a lottery type system and that's not actually trying to track anything about, I'm really choosing the people who have the skills for the job. It's just modeling fairness as procedure. So sometimes we care about fair procedures, sometimes we care about getting the correct results where those are independently determined, and sometimes we care about a little bit of each, I think.
So Mira, I'm interested in how your team actually measures fairness and actually tests the systems that you're building.
Yeah, so I'll give an example, and I'll make it, I won't give the exact example, but let's say we were looking at a system that decides who should come into this room or who should not. One of the things that we do is we work with the team who's designing that algorithm, and before we even start collecting any data, we start running through the scenarios for how we might operate around this system. And so we identify different groups of people. We call that subgroup classification, and so we're identifying here's different categories of people that might end up using it. You might have children coming in and out on the weekend with their families. You might have people with head coverings. You might have people coming in on a rainy day, and it changes the environmental factors. And so we start going through all of the scenarios, and we create a set of stakeholders, we create a set of scenarios, and then we use that to decide how we're going to collect data. And so we use that to inform our data collection effort, and at the same time that we're collecting data, we start deciding, hey, how do we set benchmarks for the outcomes of these subgroups, and what kind of false positives do we want to have, what kind of error rates do we want to have, and we start coming up with a model around that. And then as we start designing our algorithms, one of the things we're trying to do is we've got a whole platform we use, and we call it our dev inner loop. So it's a place that developers go and put their models in, and they test it against test data that they might have just collected with themselves. They might test it against ground truth data that we've collected explicitly. And then we're trying to put benchmarks in place in that platform that can take our estimates around error and false positives and say, okay, how are we performing now against this very tagged data set that we used during our scenario identification? So it's something we're testing out. We haven't finished going through that entire system yet, but I think that this is something that the team hasn't thought of before. I'll give you an example. We had a piece of hardware technology that we were using to detect irises and gaze tracking. And after a while, we realized that there was a category of people that it just didn't work for, and we weren't really sure why. We thought we had collected, tens of thousands of eyeballs. We thought we had enough. Quantity was more important at the time instead of quality. And we realized that green eyeballs just perform differently in the system, and we didn't have enough of them, and they were actually hard for us to collect. And so some of the things we discover after the fact, and we discover them through anomalies or bugs, and then it requires us to be really thoughtful about understanding why that happened, because we may not even, it's easy to think about race and gender and those explicit qualities, but then there are things that you don't typically think about. I wouldn't expect blue and green eyeballs to perform differently as we're tracking where they're looking. That was done a while ago, but you can imagine looking at the system and how it's performing, and where you see bugs and anomalies, we have to go and dig deeper into that and do a little bit more work on it.
Great. So you mentioned in your answer a couple of different sort of application areas there. Mm-hmm. So seeing who should be let into a room or not, maybe tracking somebody's eyes for some purpose. Mm-hmm. And then there's a bunch of other areas that you can think of where machine learning is either currently used or could be used. And I'm interested in getting some perspectives from the panelists about what you think are the most important areas in which tech companies will face fairness issues.
I can start with a couple. One is, one is, there's a whole, employment is one example. So there was a whole panel about LinkedIn before, but so LinkedIn is a platform where it directly gives you access to jobs, let's say. But there's roundabout ways in which you can also face these issues. So for example, there's a company called HireVue that records people on camera and then does emotion recognition on them and then gives that information to the people who are interviewing the interviewers, right? And so the people who are providing, like Affectiva is providing emotion recognition technology to this company I don't know how that would work. Like if it was found that they were discriminating by certain attributes, and then that was due to the technology, the emotion recognition technology or other things that they were using from this third party like company, you know, I think, you know, you could face these kinds of things in a roundabout manner too, even if you're, you know, providing face recognition technology or some other thing that then is used by some third-party entity to, you know, make decisions about people's lives.
I would agree that hiring is a great example of a domain where you want to be fair, especially because, for what Timnit said before, that if you have a diverse group of people, you can make sure your products are fairer as well. So there's kind of a compounding effect there. If your products are not working in certain neighborhoods or for certain groups of people, you're more likely to notice that if you have a diverse workforce. So making fair hiring algorithms would help for that.
We have a question over here.
Yeah, I do, and I guess in large part it's probably for Deborah, but I'm not sure. So one thing that came out, especially say applications like hiring, and actually from your story when I started raising my hand, that one way to figure out fairness is to test for these groups, like test if the, you know, if the face recognition works just as well for very dark faces than for light faces or some other, but there's aspiration of fairness. They're protected, legally protected attributes that we may not discriminate based on sex and race and whatnot. And I guess with this data-driven world, I think it's a very natural idea that the only way we can be fair if we actually use the protected attribute in our decision-making, for the obvious reason, because the protected attribute is so correlated with a lot of other stuff that not using it doesn't allow us to even test for the things you're testing for. But that raises a legal question, and maybe all of you, but you're the lawyer, so hence maybe you. You know, will the legal community accept this? That so in order to be fair to the protected groups, the systems actually have to use the protected attribute. That's the way to make it fair, rather than the, you know, ideal that we are fair to women if we don't use sex as an attribute.
Right. So the legal system, unfortunately, perhaps has gloms onto or focuses onto whether you use race, sex, or some other protected classifications as a classification. But you have to separate two different ways that you might use it. So that I'm extrapolating, I think, from what you said. You tell me if I have gotten it right. So suppose you have an algorithm that doesn't use race or sex, but after it pops out a bunch of things, you check to see whether there are very few women in the pool or very few racial minorities in the pool. So you're looking at the results in terms of the racial classifications produced, and then thinking, well, that's too much of a disparate impact on women or racial minorities. So let's revisit the stuff that goes into the algorithm. That, I think, is perfectly permissible. And I think in the literature, there's been this worry that the court's decision in Ricci somehow, which I can talk about later or whatever, somehow doesn't allow that. And I think that's a dramatic overreading of Ricci. I think that's perfectly permissible. But if one of the traits that's actually in your algorithm is race or sex, I think you will get into legal trouble. And I think what you point out about that is that's an unfortunate effect of the way that currently our legal system understands what's prohibited, and it's not something that's easy to fix because it's the court's interpretation of constitutional law. So, well, let me say that it's somewhat easy to fix if you're talking about employers, but not if you're talking about the government. So the Constitution only affects governmental actors, but you know there are a lot of governmental actors. So
I just want to jump in here. I recognize that I am not a panelist, so I will keep this very brief. I did write a paper on exactly this topic this summer with a lawyer, where we looked at really the law and specifically disparate treatment and thought about ways in which it might be okay to use those attributes. And one of the scenarios that we looked at was the case where those kinds of individual level sensitive attributes are used during the training process to develop your classifier, but then at deployment time, it has no such access to those attributes. And we argue that that is fine from a disparate treatment perspective. The paper is not currently online, but probably will be online within the next few weeks, and I will email you and let you know when it is.
Can I ask a very quick question? Sorry, because
Thank you, but I guess just as a follow-up comment, I told Debbie this during the break. Before all the discrimination cases for college admission, Cornell Engineering used to have weighing differently the SAT scores for women than for men, and the argument they made, which I actually support as an argument, that SAT scores on its own are not something we care about. We care about them as a predictor of college performance, and they had data to show that lower SAT scores for women same SAT score for women predicts higher GPA, and therefore they can weigh up the GPAs for women. They no longer do it because I guess it's not legal, but it's kind of sad. They had a point.
So I have a much more general question, which is that we are very focused on U.S. law, and we have like companies that are operating globally. We have machine learning conferences that are international, researchers that are international, and this area of fairness is intertwined with legal systems and how. I mean, I don't know. How do we? And our algorithms that we're coming up with, the scenarios we're coming up with, are very intertwined with U.S. law, and I don't know how to address that. You know, what do we do? Do you have like different researchers in different places addressing it based on like different legalities? Should we have one more international law or something like this? Because
this comes up in privacy as well, especially with the GDPR at the moment, which is specifically Europe, but yet we look at companies like Microsoft that are international companies, and suddenly that is applied everywhere, not just within Europe. So I think there's perhaps stuff we can learn from some of these other disciplines as well.
I think it also ties into the first panel on long-term thinking, where maybe we should think about what is ethical or fair in a philosophical way also, as researchers, and then maybe over time the laws will change or catch up with that.
That's also a very Western-centric view. And one of the things we debate ad nauseum in our group is, are we pushing too much of a Western-centric viewpoint because we are an international corporation? And when you talk about privacy and you look at other cultures, large parts of the world view privacy and fairness quite differently than we do in the Western side of the world. And it's not something we have resolved anything yet, but it is a constant source of tension and debate because there are such different viewpoints on it. And certain cultures don't emphasize individuals in the same way versus collective, and so trying to navigate that is a massive challenge for us.
Question over there?
Mira's kind of made my point. I was going to reinforce it. Sometimes, sure, things that occur in one jurisdiction become best practice, and a large number of jurisdictions adopt them. You're now saddled with GDPR, bad luck. It came out of Europe, America seems to have adopted it and gold-plated it, and you have an even worse system that we're re-importing. There are other areas where governments won't accept that. The rights of US government to access data are things that make European governments in particular want data kept in Europe for precisely those kind of protections. And so I think there is a very broad question of what does internationalization mean with a whole batch of these questions. And for companies like Microsoft, who sells products globally, how do you parameterize those things? It's not as easy as changing the languages in and out. You're changing moral codes in and out. And how do you represent that in your systems and your technology?
So what I was going to say that I think relates to that point is that it's one thing if one legal regime has a standard here and another one is just higher, but it's a totally different thing if they actually conflict. And I think around discrimination, they're more potentially in conflict, so the problems are a little deeper than just a higher floor.
I mean, just to build on that a little bit, so Brad Smith published a blog post calling for government regulation of face recognition technology in July. And I want to sort of dig into this and say, is that the right approach? And who should be making decisions about what makes a system fair or ethically okay? Is it the government? which government? How do you reconcile those differences? Or is it companies like Microsoft or developers or perhaps the people who are going to be deploying these systems?
So Deborah and I were talking about this during lunch, I think. And in some cases, you have legal precedent to set the floor. And we come in and say, you know what, we don't think the floor is acceptable enough, and let's go a notch higher or 2 notches higher. In other instances, like facial recognition technologies, there is no floor yet set by the government. And so we could go in and say, here's what we think a potential floor is. And in Brad Smith's post, what he called on was legislation to be used in this category because it's such a critical piece, and not just facial recognition, but I also think biometrics. And so in that one, maybe corporations who are doing technology work in the space work alongside with regulators to define the space, educate each other, and sort of set a floor around behavior there.
I would agree with that, and just add one thing that legal answers or legal interventions are going to be more cumbersome and often after the fact, and laws often tend to be more, they're not as targeted to a specific problem that occurs. And so I think even if you have the law coming in, there's always going to be a role for companies to supplement that.
So I guess I was rather hoping an economist would ask this question, but like, what's wrong with just letting the market fix it? Like, if your face recognition software is biased, then people aren't going to buy it. And if you have these accurate data sheets, then, they know what they're getting, and they can just not buy something that doesn't do what they want it to do. And, if they do buy it and they release a product that is biased, then people aren't going to buy the product and the company will go
But I think the issue is, like, for me, it's pretty crazy that it took for Joy and I's paper for, like, Kamala Harris is citing it when she's, writing to the FBI and things like this. People have been using face recognition forever, right? And so, they've been using it in law enforcement. The companies have been using it. So even though it was biased for a long time, people have been using it. So for me, I'm not an economist, so I don't know much about markets. But for me, this says the market hasn't been fixing it. And also, a lot of times I think that when you have something that unfairly punishes minorities, it could be a minority of people who don't really have a voice. I don't know if the market helps these people, right? I think this is legislature, in my opinion.
So, I mean, the point of anti-discrimination law is to protect groups that don't have either the political power or the economic power to protect themselves in the marketplace, which is why I'm actually not worried about the green-eyed eyeball thing, because I think you would expect the market to self-correct, that the point of anti-discrimination law is to protect those groups that historically haven't been able either economically or politically to protect themselves.
Question over there?
I keep on saying minority, and then Joy always says the undersampled majority. I love that term, so I'm going to correct myself. The undersampled majority.
Which is a good example of my point. The data sheets are a good step in the right direction, but as somebody who studies metadata and information retrieval, metadata itself is socially constructed and has lots of biases built in. So we've got to have what we really need here is a governance process too. There's a lot of, who's going to watch the watchers around metadata processes too. So I would add that to the fairness issues.
Great. Another question over there?
Yeah, it was actually more of a comment. I was mentioning it to you before. I'm Tina Al-Yasserat. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a professor at Northeastern University. I think it's not the job of machine learning to fix the biases that are in the data because our society is broken. I think the job of machine learning is to show that the policies are not being enforced correctly and go back and change those policies. So as opposed to using machine learning to make human decisions, we should use machine learning to show that the data that's coming out of the enforcements of the policies are bad, go to policymakers, and have the policies get changed or the enforcement of it get changed.
How would that work in, like, let's say, hiring? I'm trying to understand your question, your comment. So when you have an automated tool that is then shown to break certain laws that already exist, like let's say Equal Employment Opportunity Act or something like that, then don't you think that the automated tool itself should change to not break that law?
So the question is the algorithm doing the wrong thing, or is the data that you're getting from the enforcement of the policy, let's say stop and frisk, right? So there's a stop and frisk policy, I have cameras on cops, it's taking data in. And if I can, from that data, reconstruct the intent of the policy and then say, look, did you intend your policy to do X to the policymaker, right? And if the person says yes, and that the intent is, oh, wait a second, stop and frisk is stopping black and brown people more than others, and is that what is your intent? I bet most policymakers will say, no, that was not my intent of stop and frisk. But the question is, how do you actually change society? Not that, oh, I have to come up with a machine learning algorithm because it's going to be used in human decision making because we have all this data that's coming out. Because the human decision makers are using it mostly for efficiency purposes, right? That's why they like risk assessments, which are very bad in my perspective because they don't give you any uncertainty about the algorithm, right? 8, right? So Tina goes to jail.
I don't think we would disagree that it's a bad idea to use data to point out problems we have with our policies, but at the same time, our systems are being used already today in the world which is already biased. And so you have to make decisions, and you can say, you know, as a company, well, it's unfair that, you know, the number of applicants of minorities and, you know, women for a computer company is unbalanced, and that poses all kinds of problems we have in our educational system and earlier on. But we don't want to just say, let's wait until they solve that. And then when we have 50-50, we have to make decisions today, and the algorithms have to make decisions in where we are right now.
So I guess my answer to that is that it's not that we have to wait, it's that it has to be in parallel,
Exactly.
right? And the other
Yeah.
one is that what are the incentives of the decision makers that are using your algorithms, right? Because it wasn't like before they were using the data, right? I'm not saying, so obviously we have stupid algorithms, right? Like mandatory minimum sentencing that do not look at data, right? But the question is, you have to take into account the incentives of the people who are using your algorithms. And I don't think people are really looking into that.
So I think all the cases don't look like the stop and frisk kind of case, that there are some cases where there are injustices or unfairnesses in the past that I think those of us who are in this world caring about algorithms don't want to compound those prior injustices, and that's an independent concern. So one example I like to use is insurance companies who, and this doesn't involve any complicated AI, but who would charge domestic abuse victims more for health and life insurance, because if you're being beaten up by your husband or boyfriend, you are more likely to need health or life insurance. Now, the insurance company wasn't the one that was responsible for the women being beaten up, and in fact, even after you left your batterer, you were most at risk, so they would charge them higher rates even if they'd left their batterer. But I think the response to most people have is there's something unfair about that, and it's not that it's not an accurate reflection of their actuarial risk, and it's not that the insurance company is somehow responsible for perpetrating the violence against these women, yet still you might think they shouldn't compound that injustice, that an injustice had been done to someone, and there's something morally troubling about carrying that injustice into another domain. Now, not only the woman got beaten up, but now she can't even get health or life insurance. So I think there are a lot of situations that raise those kinds of questions that I think are important to think about.
I wanted to ask a question back to the original idea about fairness. And so I have a lot of concern about facial recognition ever being used on balance better or well for society than on balance injuring us as a society. And so one of the things that I'm thinking a lot about is, when does a company or when does a technologist that develops a system say, this isn't going to work in the way, there's too much unfairness, and so I'm just cutting bait. It's done. And I'd like to know what the metric, if that's ever happened in your experience, and what the metric is. And I'll just give you the example. In law, there was a brief time when the death penalty was determined to be not working the way we, as a society, needed it to work. And so we stopped in the United States administering it. We've now gone back to it, thinking that it's now working better. But there were metrics by which that was being measured. We could agree or disagree about whether those are the right metrics and whether it's still working. But I'd like to hear from a technology perspective whether there is an indication that it is so unfair or the outcome is so wrong that we can't fix it. And
It's a very good question. I'm thinking a lot about this right now because, for example, when our paper, with Joy's paper first came out, some people were saying was, why are you trying to fix it? Because we know that for African Americans, for example, it's being used unfairly, and so even if it works perfectly, should we have this technology? I have a lot of thoughts about this, but I think the two things are separate, right? Like there's one thing where you're showing disparity in how something works, and then the second thing is what that thing is being used for. And so in one way, the fact that we showed disparity, I think, helps people now say, we need to have legislation. For example, in California, right? The Senate, there was legislation passed on the Senate floor or on the Senate floor to say that before law enforcement uses face recognition technology, we have to audit it in California. Like so right now, that's not happening, right? Everybody was just using face recognition technology the way they wanted it. But at least showing this disparity now starts to have the conversation where the public and our elected officials and everybody else can actually at least make a decision about whether we want to use it in certain use cases or not. But I don't support a complete ban on face recognition technology under any circumstances whatsoever. I mean, I might change my mind if I talk to other people about this, because there are some cases in which, for example, when Affectiva, the emotion recognition technology, was started, Rana talks about how she was working with kids, with autistic kids, and how this was helping, kids with autism. And people have written about older people with dementia and how some of this technology might help. So I think we have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. And for certain applications, like for example, screening people at the airport, there's too many false positives. I don't think it should be used for that purpose, right? But then there's other applications for which you might still want to use it for.
Eric.
There's a good question you asked about, how do we make these decisions? And just in terms of a couple of cases, people here might know about the Ether Committee at Microsoft, an advisory board that we have Mira and Hanna serving on. The folks on that board helped to craft the blog that was written on face recognition, and there was some recent cases that have come to the board where Microsoft, the board itself, and then the senior leadership team of Microsoft said, that's okay. Something, this scenario we're just not comfortable with, we're not doing that contract. And there's a reasoning that goes on. Typically, it's not metric based or accuracy based. In this case, we don't understand that usage well enough and how it's going to work in terms of its implications for human rights, and freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, how the errors are going to work out in real life. We have to study that further. And sometimes it doesn't even get down to accuracy. It's like even perfectly accurate facial recognition, perfectly fair biometric that, let's say, one of our or several people on the panel might agree with. Even perfect recognition is can cause a chilling effect when it comes to freedom of expression and freedom of assembly when used in a public square. So it depends on the usage and so on. But I can just make a comment here, and it's okay because we're going to be going out and we're going to be public about these. I just whispered. I said, "Is this being videoed?" Because I wanted to. I was going to gauge my level of precision on this. It's not how they talk about this. But we're going to be going public about some of these cases for feedback without the names of the various customers, for example. But there's been we've actually had really interesting deliberations on this committee and working with their SLT. And we've said no several times and yes several times, and we try to take those deliberations and the answers we come up with cross-company and within divisions as specifics that we try to generalize into principles to make it easier the next time around, and then we keep on watching the technology as it evolves. So I hope that helps with give you some examples.
So I just want to build on that a little bit and ask a question about how technology companies should be making those yes versus no kind of decisions. Should we be using some kind of ethical framework to guide these decisions, some set of ethical principles that we've decided on, or should we be using some other means?
So I think it's both of those. Plus, I actually really like what Microsoft has put in place, because there's various levels of thinking and checks and balances. At the corporate level, the Ether board is looking across the company at scenarios and then generalizing that into broad guidelines, broad principles that you can then go and take and apply at the local level. And then there are groups like mine. There's actually another group that's similar in how they operate, that go and do governance at a local level and say, okay, we have these principles. Now, how do we apply it at a local level? How do we apply these principles of fairness, accountability, transparency, privacy, all of these on our technologies around face recognition, speech recognition? And so this sort of two-tier model, I think, is very interesting because it lets us scale and operate at like what corporate decisions do we want to make and what do we say yes and no to? And then locally, how do we put things in place around tooling, around culture change and educating people, around changing how we do our design and development? And that's happening at a very local level because it is very specific to the culture of the team, the technology they're working on. But having this sort of laddering up, I think, is a very interesting model to explore because it lets you cover very different audiences and very different needs, and moves the company forward in a positive way. Because if you just had the corporate level, what would happen is it would be PR speak and would just be talk that was very hard to translate into how we apply. And if you just had the applied level, you wouldn't have the broad company orientation. And so I think that these two groups, to me, it's a fascinating experiment, and there's something very good about that I think other companies could model.
Great. Well, with that, we are out of time. Thank you, everybody. Let's thank our panelists.